Our story starts in the summer of 1762, when the king of Joseon ordered his only surviving son to climb into a wooden rice chest before he nailed him in alive. For 8 long days, Crown Prince Sado begged and pleaded for his life beneath the burning July sun, and when the scratching finally stopped and the box was finally opened, he was dead, dehydrated, and starved. This isn't just the story of royal cruelty, it's the story of a faithfully doomed relationship between a father and a son, and shows the damage that neglect and mental abuse can have on the human mind, even in an era when mental health wasn't as understood as it is today. Welcome back to The Rose's Past. I'm Rose, and today we're going to be traveling to 18th century Korea to uncover one of the most haunting and debated tragedies in royal history, the life and death of Crown Prince Sado. To understand Sado's life, we first need to understand his beginning. After all, that's where we all start. He was born in 1735 by Lady Sunhui, a concubine of King Yeongjo. Born into a dynasty obsessed with perfection, his father, King Yeongjo, was a brilliant but volatile ruler who had fought his way to the legitimacy after the suspicious death of his half-brother. Haunted by doubt and fearing that his rule would be seen as illegitimate, Yeongjo demanded flawlessness, not only from himself but from his officials and especially from his heir. With the help of Lady Hyegyong's memoirs, we're going to be getting a deeply intimate view of the events that led up to the rice box incident, from the perspective of Prince Sados Wife herself. Lady Hyegyong documents that King Yeongjo also had obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Notably, he would use 2 separate gates to go to court, depending on whether the session would be positive or negative in topic. He used one gate for positive meetings, the Maenyan Gate, and the other for misfortune or hardship, the Gyeonghwa Gate. Not only that, but after each day in court, he would religiously wash his ears, brush his teeth, and summon someone to say at least one word to him before entering his own home, symbolically to wash away the day as to not bring the energy into his house. Additionally, he forbade people that he disliked from staying close to those that he did like, and he also didn't allow the people that he disliked to use the same roads as the people that he did like. He would change his clothes from the day after a negative court session when visiting one of his favorite children, lest he bring the bad energy to them. There are many additional oddities that I read during my research, and we'll be sure to touch back on those a little bit later. Sado was the king's second son, who arrived a few years after the death of his older brother. The dynasty was in a panic, so the arrival of the little prince was really a joyous occasion. By the order of King Yeongjo, the little prince was taken as a young baby to live in his own palace, far away from his mother and his father. The king, feeling guilty over his own brother's death, and perhaps in an attempt to rectify what had happened that year, placed the young prince in the care of the household staff of his late brother. This would prove to be the beginning of the end for the young prince. From the age of 2, Prince Sado's life followed a very strict schedule of reviewing Confucian texts at dawn, archery and military drills before breakfast, and then finally calligraphy, moral philosophy, and political theory until nightfall. Prince Sado was recorded to be very advanced in age, walking by the age of 6 months and responding to his father in speech by the time he was a year old. The king held his son in very high regard, and on one documented occasion, when the prince was in the presence of his father and the scholars, he was asked what the difference is between luxury and not luxury. The prince was able to point to his silk robe and name it luxury, and then point to his cotton underrobes and call it not luxury. This was a very proud moment for the king. However, the king would soon go on to press harder, stressing that his son should be upright in all matters. This meant that ordinary child activities such as playing were highly discouraged. Prince's servants disagreed. They would often let the prince put away his books and instead play games of war. By this, we can take it to mean shooting arrows, playing with swords, and being involved in horse riding. Because of this, the prince started to neglect his studies, and when the emperor found out, he had the maids punished and he developed a very strong dislike towards them. But, strangely enough, he didn't have the maids switched out. As a result for his disdain for the young prince's maids, the king's visit to the crown prince became fewer and fewer. This rejection from his father hit the prince hard emotionally, and he became nervous when around his father, fearing that he was the cause of his father's hate, and this often led to small mistakes. A single stumble could provoke His Majesty's wrath, and in those endless palace records, between the lines of ceremony and protocol, something else begins to appear. The signs of a child under immense psychological strain. Even as a boy, Sado displayed deep anxiety and sudden mood swings. It was recorded by his wife that by the age of 10, she noticed that he moved and ate strangely. Although she did not elaborate on this, we can take it as the first sign that there was indeed something wrong with Prince Sado. As Sado grew, so did his father's expectations of him, and his terror of failing them. In 1749, at the age of just 14, he made a minor mistake during an official audience. Perhaps a mispronounced word, perhaps an imperfect bow. The king erupted and called him morally defective in front of the entire court. In fact, the king made it a frequent habit of his to reprimand his son in front of the eunuchs, palace maids, scholars, and the court officials. From that day on, something inside of Prince Sado began to fracture. Lady Hyegyong's memoirs state that there was nothing that the prince could do that his father found satisfactory. He was constantly discontented and angry with his son, and it reached a point where the occurrences of cold spells, droughts, poor harvests, or even any strange natural occurrences, the king would blame it on his son's insufficient virtue, and he would blame him for any of the negative things that would happen. This affected the prince most severely, for whenever the weather was cloudy or if there was any thunder, the prince would grow very nervous and fearful that his father was going to yell at him. Before long, he was frightened, anxious, and terrified over everything, and the illness developed gradually as his sense of terror grew. And then it's recorded that he started to have strange notions. Prince Sado was never invited, not even once, to the grand events that were happening in the palace, such as examinations, archery competitions, or displays of martial arts. Instead, he was only asked to do the grim and negative things like oversee the year-end reevaluation of criminal cases. Being constantly excluded, the prince simply couldn't maintain a sense of proper balance, and he started to slip ever deeper and deeper into his illness. Another harrowing discovery is that whenever the king was personally conducting the trials of criminals, whenever a person was sentenced to death, and once again in the presence of a crowd, the king was sent for the prince, forcing him to witness the executions one by one. Even more disturbingly, it was recorded that each night on his way home, His Majesty would stop at the prince's residence and call out for the prince, and ask him, "How are you?" As soon as the prince would reply, His Majesty would then wash his ears immediately on the spot and throw the dirty water into the yard of another daughter that he also disliked, before turning around and heading home without hearing a single additional word. That the prince's word might wash off all of the terrible things associated with the day, so that His Majesty might be able to enter his own home cleansed. He would do this to the prince nightly. Things reached a peak when two royal women, Queen Joseon and Queen Dowager Inwon, were gravely ill. Queen Joseon was like the prince's mother, and he would visit her each day, crying and pleading for her to return to health. He would nurse by her bedside, giving her the medicine that she was prescribed, and overall he was very attentive. That is, until the king arrived, at which point the prince would sit himself quietly in a corner of the room and say nothing. The prince did this because he was terrified of his father criticizing his very being. We understand this behavior nowadays, but the king viewed it as the prince being unfilial to the queen. On one occasion, during a visit, the king roared at the prince because of his clothing, as one of his trouser ties was not tied correctly. In that same month, as documented by Lady Hyegyong, she writes, "Prince Sado began to kill. The first person he killed was Kim Han-chae, a eunuch who happened to be on duty that day. The prince came in with the severed head and displayed the bloody head to the ladies-in-waiting and to me." Before we get into his phobia of clothes, we should talk about what happened when the king found out that the prince was murdering people. From the memoirs, what transpired was recorded word for word. The prince was summoned to His Majesty's hall, where the king criticized the prince for many things. Then, probably wanting to see whether the prince would tell the truth, though he knew that the prince had been killing people, His Majesty ordered him to confess everything that he had done. Even though the prince was in terrible fear that once his father found out what he had done, he would be ended, he told his father, "When anger grips me, I cannot contain myself. Only after I kill something, a person, perhaps an animal, even a chicken, can I calm down." "Why is that?" His Majesty asked. "Because I am deeply hurt," replied the prince. "And why are you so hurt?" "I am sad that your Majesty does not love me, and terrified when you criticize me. All this turns to anger." The prince then reported in detail the number of people he had killed, hiding nothing at that moment. His Majesty, perhaps for the first time responding to his natural instincts as a father, or perhaps allowing his sage heart to be overcome with pity, said, "From now on, I will not be that way." Unfortunately, those words were short-lived as the king returned to his usual treatment of the prince not long afterward. Once the usual treatment resumed, the prince's clothing phobia was severely triggered. It was documented that it was a strange, mysterious affliction for him to get dressed. "I have to have 10, 20, or even 30 sets of clothes laid aside. He would then burn some, supposedly on behalf of some ghost or other, and then after this, if he managed to get into a suit of clothes without incident, one had to count it as great luck. If, however, those serving him were to make the slightest error, he would not be able to put on his clothes no matter how hard he tried. In the process, people were hurt and even killed. It was truly dreadful. On the rare occasion that the prince was able to get into a set of clothing, he wore them until they were filthy." To further the psychological abuse that Prince Sado was receiving from the king also did not permit his son to visit the graves of the two older royals that had died, Queen Joseon and Queen Dowager Inwan. However, on one occasion he did permit his son to accompany him, and unfortunately that year was very rainy, and on the day that they were supposed to visit the tomb, there were torrential downpours, and, as you would expect, the prince was blamed for the downpours. And just after the procession arrived at the destination, he was ordered to return to the palace. He was sent away at the entrance, and he did not get to pay respects to his grandmother, Queen Chosong. And later, after brooding over this incident for a little bit, he suspected that maybe it was his clothing that had caused his father's displeasure. And so, as a result, his clothing phobia became even worse. The prince's madness started to come to a head at the beginning of 1760. It grew worse, and with King Yeongjong's renewal of his criticism, which daily became even more scathing, the prince's explosions of rage grew more and more violent, and his clothes phobia became more and more intense. He began to hallucinate, imagining that he was seeing people, and before he went anywhere, he'd make sure to send people ahead to clear the roads. If for some reason someone was unable to be removed, and the prince was seen, the prince would not be able to continue to wear the clothes that he had on, and he had to remove them immediately. But to change his uniform, he had to have many sets burned before he could get into one. This process continued for a period of 6 to 7 years. On Prince Sado's birthday, the king invariably held a formal audience to summon the prince's tutors and discuss and criticize the prince. This hurt the prince deeply as it was repeated year after year, and it became a source of deep sorrow for him. Never once was he let to sit at his birthday feast in peace. Something was always going wrong, so the prince inevitably fasted on his birthday instead to avoid the criticism. This caused the whole court to buzz with tension each and every year. The prince's illness became so severe that when he started to read official documentation from the king praising his son, the grand heir, he would read the records and see that his father loved his grandson more, and he would be crazy with rage over this. People started to fear that the more the prince was reading about how the king loved the grandson more, the more that he was going to harm his own child. Lady Hyegyong got to the point where she would have the eunuchs edit the records before they were even given to the prince, so that he wouldn't see the praise that his son was getting. A quote from her memoir says, "The survival of the dynasty depended entirely upon the grand heir. His safety alone ensured its preservation. Moreover, his safety depended on finding a way not to let the prince see those remarks of his majesty." But there was no way to stop the prince from reading the proceedings of the royal lectures. What she did was she asked a eunuch to keep an eye on the copy that was brought in for the prince's view, and if the copy contained any problematic passages, they were to be deleted, and then the passages to be rewritten before submitting them to the prince. She says, "Sometimes when I knew that the situation was particularly urgent, I went to the eunuch in charge on the day and had him remove the passages in my presence." The situation was becoming dire, and the prince's rage was leaving 5 to 7 people dead a day. The prince had gotten into a habit of exploring outside of the palace, and he would go for month-long stints where he would leave, and his wife would need to cover for his absence. Prince Sado came down with a disease, and he suffered terribly for several months. Lady Hyegyong felt that his illness probably occurred because he hadn't taken proper care of his body during his wanderings outside of the city. In her memoir, she states, "It is against normal human affection to say this, but in retrospect, having seen him go through what he did, the saddest and most horrid fate, one unprecedented in human history, I regret that he did not die of this illness." After a few months, the king found out about the prince's traveling outside of the palace, and he was incredibly irate at his son's secret trips. Once the prince found out that his father knew about the trips, he said to his wife, "I am afraid that I won't be safe this time. I wonder what should I do." She documents that she was feeling heavy in the chest, and she said it is a very vexing situation, but even so, what could His Majesty possibly do? Only to be returned with the response, "Don't you see? He loves the Grand Heir, and as long as there is the Grand Heir, he would not care if he had to get rid of me. You don't think of the obvious. He hates me more and more. Really, it's getting unspeakably bad. He can, you see, obliterate me by first opposing me and then making the Grand Heir an adopted son of Prince Hyegyong. You just wait and see. He is fond of you, and even though you and the children belong to me, all of you will be all right. But I won't be. I always had to bear it alone. No, he won't let me live. Don't you see what I'm driven to? This hopeless and wretched illness?" It is striking to me that Prince Sado could so clearly see the outcome of his future. One night, during one of the prince's episodes, he snuck around the palace with a knife. And when this was found out, the prince was accused of trying to kill the king. In the end, it was the prince's mother, Lady Sunhui, who in fear painstakingly turned her own son into the king. As soon as the king heard this rumor, he immediately requested to be taken to the Chandok Palace, the current residence of Prince Sado, going through the Gyeonghwa Gate. When the prince heard that the king was coming, he didn't run. He simply said to his wife, "It looks very bad, but they will let you live. Oh, how I fear their intentions." About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Lady Hyegyong was informed that a eunuch had come requesting a rice chest from the kitchen. She didn't understand what it meant or why the chest was being asked for, but soon the gravity of the situation became clear to them, and the king's grandson desperately went to beg the king to spare his father. The king ordered him sternly that he needed to leave, and the Grand Heir was dragged away. The Lady Hyegyong, now sitting outside of the gate, could see nothing through it. She could only hear the sound of a sword that the king was rapping, and the pitiful pleas of the prince. "Father, Father, I have done wrong. Here within I will do everything you say. I will study, I will obey you in everything, I promise. Please do not do this to me." But his father ignored his pleas, and he was then stripped of his princely title and ordered into the chest. Contrary to popular belief, the prince didn't fight this command. He simply and freely got into the rice chest and sat down in it, and the king then ordered to have the rice chest nailed shut. Days passed, and it was too hard for everyone to imagine the prince's state, and on the 15th the king had the rice chest bound further tightly with thick rope and covered deeply with grass and moved to the upper palace. After that it seemed that all hope was lost. Lady Hyegyong writes, "And then, on the 20th at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a torrential rain with much thunder. The thought of the prince's terror of the thunder made me so restless. I just could not bear to imagine it." She next reports the horrible news. The prince was reported to have responded up until the storm, so it must be that he died during the rain. In the end, Prince Sado died wretchedly, abandoned by his parents and trapped in his worst nightmare with no chance of escaping. After his death, he was reinstated as a prince, and his son, the Grand Heir, was officially adopted by Prince Hyegyong, just as the prince had predicted. This was the second premonition of the prince. Many years earlier, when Lady Hyegyong was pregnant, Prince Sado awoke from a dream about a huge black dragon. He took a large banner and he painted the dragon of his dream on the banner, saying this showed he would have a son, and his son would be the greatest ruler Joseon would ever have. When the queen birthed her son, the prince's dream was considered to have come true. The baby was large and strong, and it was written that he had the appearance of a king. Prince Sado's ability to foresee the future really was truly unbelievable. Prince Sado's young son, just 11 years old at the time, would later ascend the throne as King Yeongjo. Yeongjo's reign was marked by reform, innovation, and quiet sorrow for his father. He built memorials to his father, but avoided speaking of his death. In every reform he passed, historians sensed the shadow of a boy who watched his family collapse from within. King Yeongjo, meanwhile, lived another 14 years, reportedly tormented by the nightmares and guilt. Palace observers wrote that he often stood alone in the courtyard where that box had once stayed, staring at the ground for hours. Historians still argue about what truly happened between Yeongjo and Sado. Some believe that Yeongjo had no choice, that the prince's violence made him a danger to the dynasty. Others insist that the court's rigid hierarchy and the king's obsession with perfection and his very clear distinction between what is good and what was ominous destroyed a sensitive boy and turned him into an unstable young man. Modern psychiatric scholars like Dr. Kim Song-soo view the case as an early tragedy of untreated mental illness, and in this case, that mental illness could have been hereditarily passed down to him from the king himself. In the Joseon dynasty, morality and mental health were indistinguishable. To falter emotionally was to fail ethically, and in a world that worshipped filial piety, one must wonder if Prince Sado ever really had a chance. Crown Prince Sado's death was the tragedy of unchecked and misunderstood mental illness, a person forced to live between the lines of a razor blade. If nothing you do is right, does anything you do really matter? It's easy today to understand this sentiment, and it's truly heartbreaking that Prince Sado's life was never going to end up in any other way. In the end, the rice box was just as constricting as Prince Sado's entire life had been. A story with such a hopeful start never should have ended with such a heartbreaking conclusion. Thank you for watching this episode of The Roses Past. If you'd like to explore more stories where history and humanity intersect, please consider subscribing. Until next time, remember, the more you know.